The prison sat on the edge of the city like something the city wanted to forget. Tall gray walls. Barbed wire catching the morning light in ways that looked almost pretty if you didn't know what it was holding in. And, inside those walls, inside that concrete world where every sound echoed twice and every door had a lock and every human being wore either a uniform or a number, two men were about to become something neither of them had a name for yet. Marcus Webb had worked as a correctional officer for 11 years. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much about himself. You wouldn't catch him at the staff table telling stories or laughing too loud over lunch. He did his rounds. He kept his eyes open. He went home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made peace with that shape a long time ago. He was broad-shouldered, quiet-spoken, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, not because he was hiding something, but because somewhere along the line he had learned that in a place like this, showing too much of yourself was the same as offering it up to be used against you. He had worked plenty of blocks in his time. High security. Isolation. The young offenders wing, which was the hardest of all because of what you saw in those boys' faces. But Block D was where he spent most of his days now, and Block D was where George was. George Allenby had been inside for 6 years. He was 53 years old, soft-spoken, with silver threading through his hair and hands that had the look of someone who had once worked with them, calluses still there, years after the work had stopped. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't involve himself in the politics of the block, the quiet power plays, the shifting alliances that every prisoner either participated in or stayed carefully clear of. George stayed clear. He kept to himself in a way that wasn't unfriendly, just contained. He read. He kept his cell orderly. He answered when spoken to and was never the first to speak. The other inmates had a name for him. Old Quiet. Not said cruelly, just as a fact, the way you'd name a landmark. Marcus noticed George the way you notice something that doesn't fit the expected noise of a place. Most men inside, even the ones who weren't violent, even the ones doing time peacefully, carried a kind of restless energy. A low-level hum of tension that never fully went away. George didn't have that. He sat in the yard on the days he chose to go out and he looked at the sky in a way that Marcus, the first time he caught it, couldn't quite explain. Not like a man looking at something he missed. More like a man looking at something he was keeping safe inside himself. Their first real conversation happened by accident, the way most things that matter do. It was a Tuesday in February, one of those days where the heating in the block was doing something unpredictable, running too hot and, then, not at all, and Marcus was doing a welfare check on the cells in the East Corridor. He got to George's cell and found the man sitting at his small desk with a book open and a look on his face that wasn't quite distress but was something close to its quieter cousin. Marcus paused at the door. "You all right?" George looked up. Took a moment. "Headache," he said. "Bad one. Few days now." In another context, that would have been the end of it. Marcus would have logged it, passed it to the medical team, moved on. He did log it. He did pass it on. But he also stayed a moment longer than he needed to, and he said, "You been drinking enough water? This heat they've got going in here, it dries you out." George looked at him with the particular attention of a man who was not used to being considered. "Probably not," he said. Marcus brought him a water bottle from the supplies. Logged that too. Moved on. But the next day George had water on his desk, and when Marcus passed he gave a small nod. The kind that meant something was acknowledged without needing to be made into a thing. That was the beginning, though neither of them would have called it that. The weeks that followed were built from small moments. Marcus noticed things. He noticed that George received letters every few months, never more than 2 or 3 a year, and that after those letters arrived, George would be quieter than usual for a day or two before settling back into himself. He noticed that George read serious books, history mostly, and occasionally something that looked like poetry. He noticed that George had a photograph on his small shelf, a young woman maybe 20 years old, laughing at something off camera, and that George never spoke about her and no one ever came to visit. Marcus didn't ask. That wasn't the relationship, and he knew enough about this place to understand the difference between knowing someone and making them account for themselves. What it was something simpler and harder to name. A consistent noticing. A consistency of decency, which sounds like a small thing until you live in a place where it is rare. George began to look for Marcus on the rounds. Not in a desperate way, not in the way some men looked for a connection so hard it became its own kind of need. Just a small orientation, the way you orient toward a window in a room that doesn't have many. Inside the prison, there was a culture, unspoken, unwritten, but as real as the concrete, about what guards were for. They were authority. They were the door between inside and outside. They were, in certain dynamics, the enemy, or at least the symbol of the thing that held you. And there was a parallel culture about what prisoners were, their number, their charge, their behavior report, their release date if they had one. The system was built to keep these two things separate and legible, because legibility made management easier. Marcus understood this. He had worked within it for 11 years without incident. He wasn't naive about what this place was or what his role in it required. He didn't sentimentalize it. He'd seen enough to know that sentimentality in a place like this could get someone hurt. But he was also a man who had grown up watching his grandmother treat every person who came through her door as if they carried something worth being careful with. He hadn't thought about that in years. He didn't consciously think about it now. It just lived in him the way early things do, underneath the professional layer, underneath the institutional training, underneath the careful management of distance that the job required. There was an inmate named Darrow on Block D in mid-30s, built like someone who had spent every free hour in the yard working on it, with a way of occupying space that was about more than just his size. He had been inside for 4 years and had 2 more ahead of him. In the hierarchy that formed itself without anyone voting on it, Darrow was near the top, and he maintained that position through a specific kind of attention. He watched who was weak, who was isolated, who could be made useful, and he made his calculations accordingly. George was not weak. But he was isolated, and he had something Darrow wanted, a reputation among the older inmates for having contacts, for knowing things, for having once moved in circles that gave him access to information that still, somehow, had value. Whether this reputation was accurate was almost beside the point. Darrow believed it, and that belief was enough to make George a target. The pressure started small. A comment in the yard. A shift in the seating arrangements at meals that left George suddenly, conspicuously, at a table with men aligned to Darrow. A request, phrased as a friendly question but shaped like a threat about whether George might be willing to pass a message to someone through a channel that George supposedly still had access to. George said no. Quietly. Firmly. Without making it into something that required a public confrontation. Darrow filed it away and waited. Marcus saw the shift before George said anything about it. He saw it in the micro-adjustments, the way George chose his route through the common area, the way his reading time in the yard shortened, the way the 2-day quiet after a letter arrived stretched now to 3, then 4. Small things. The kind of things you only catch if you're paying a specific kind of attention. He didn't bring it up directly. He waited until a moment when he was making his rounds and George was in his cell, book open but eyes not moving, and he stopped at the door. "Anything I should know about," he said. "Neutral. No pressure in it." George looked at the book for a moment. Then, he looked up. "Not yet," he said. Marcus nodded. "All right," he said. And moved on. Not yet was not nothing. It was a door left open. It was a man saying, "I know you're watching, and I know why, and I haven't needed it yet but I might, and I trust that when I do, the door will still be there." Marcus held that. Quietly. Without making it into anything official, because making it official would have required George to either confirm or deny, and either of those would have shifted the power in ways that could make things worse. He simply watched more carefully. The institutional protocols around what Marcus could and couldn't do were clear. He couldn't intervene without evidence of an actual threat. He couldn't move George to another block without a documented reason. He couldn't confront Darrow without something concrete, because in the formal structure of this place, confronting an inmate without cause had its own consequences, reports, reviews, questions about whether the officer had his own agenda. The system protected itself from its own officers as much as it protected officers from inmates. So Marcus worked in the space the system left him. He adjusted his rounds to increase visibility around the areas where George was most exposed. He made small administrative decisions, table assignments, yard schedule adjustments that on paper were routine and, in practice, created a buffer. He was not subtle about this in a way that anyone could point to. He was not so obvious about it that George was marked as someone under protection, which would have made him a target in a different way. It was a precise, quiet calibration. And, it was, Marcus understood, a decision. Not the big kind that happens all at once. The slow kind. The kind where you realize, well into it, that you've been making it all along. George had done something wrong. He had pled guilty, served his time without appeal. He never talked about his case and, Marcus hadn't looked it up, not out of ignorance but out of a deliberate choice that he couldn't entirely explain except to say that what George had been was not the same thing as what George was, and he was only responsible for what George was. This was not a popular position in institutions. It was not a position Marcus had ever articulated to anyone. It just lived in how he acted, quietly, in the daily work of his rounds. The letters George received were from his daughter. Marcus knew this not because George had said so but because once, the photograph had been moved slightly on the shelf and Marcus could see the back of it, and, on the back in neat handwriting were the words, "For you, so you don't forget what's waiting." And, the photograph was the laughing young woman. And, the letters came at irregular intervals that matched, if you tracked them, with what the young woman's life might look like, a gap in letters that could be exam season, a run of 3 close together that felt like someone who had just worked up the nerve. She never visited. Marcus didn't know why. George never said. But, on the days after a letter, when the quiet stretched and the book sat unread, Marcus noticed that George's hands sometimes rested on the desk with a stillness that wasn't peace. He brought him an extra cup of tea one of those days. Said nothing. Set it down. Left. George didn't say anything either. But, the next week, during a brief exchange about nothing in particular, something about the book George was reading, which Marcus had asked about purely to fill a moment, George said, "She's getting married in the spring." No context given. No explanation. Just placed there, into the air between them, and left. Marcus said, "That's good news, then, dot." George looked at the book. "Yes," he said. "It is." That was all. The conversation turned, moved, ended. But, something had been handed over in it, and, both of them knew it, and, neither of them made it into more than it was. This was the particular language of this place, this strange and difficult place where men lived in close quarters and enormous distance simultaneously, where the telling of a real thing was done in small units and received with care, and where the fact of care itself had to be carried quietly because loudness could break it. Marcus drove home that evening and sat in his car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. He was just sitting with it, whatever it was. The weight and the shape of a day in which nothing had happened and everything had moved, slightly, in a direction that mattered. His wife asked how work was. He said fine. Because how do you explain a cup of tea? How do you explain a photograph, a letter, a man looking at the sky? How do you explain that sometimes the most significant thing you do in a day is stay in a doorway one moment longer than required? You don't. You just carry it. And, you go back the next day. And, you keep watching. March came and cold and stayed cold, and Block D settled into the particular mood that late winter brought to places like this, a low restlessness, a cabin fever energy that had nowhere useful to go. Men got on each other's nerves over small things. Tempers had shorter fuses. The staff briefings started each week with the same reminder about de-escalation protocols, and every officer on the block knew it wasn't just procedure talk. It was a real reading of the atmosphere. Marcus felt it. Everyone did. But, what Marcus also felt, running underneath the general tension like a current beneath cold water, was that something specific was building around George. Darrow had not repeated the request. That, Marcus knew, was the part to watch. When men like Darrow stopped asking, it didn't mean they'd let go. It meant they'd started calculating. He started paying attention to who sat near George in the canteen, who walked close to him in the corridor between cells and the common room. These were not things he wrote in a report. There was nothing to write yet, nothing that would hold up against the formality of documentation. What he had was pattern recognition, 11 years of living inside this place, reading its rhythms, learning its grammar, and his pattern recognition was telling him something was being arranged. He made a decision. He requested a shift adjustment. Nothing unusual, officers rotated coverage and there were always legitimate reasons to swap times. He took the late afternoon slot, which meant he was on the block during the quiet hour before dinner, the hour when the common room was most populated, when the yard was coming back in, when movement was highest and oversight was thinnest. He didn't explain this to anyone as anything other than a scheduling preference. No one asked. George noticed. Of course he did. He was a man who paid attention to things, who had learned, maybe over years and, maybe over harder lessons than that, to read his environment carefully. One afternoon, passing Marcus in the corridor, he slowed slightly, not enough to draw attention, and said, very quietly, "You don't have to." Marcus said, "I know." That was the whole exchange. They kept walking. But the shift in it was real. What George had said was not gratitude exactly. It was acknowledgement. It was a man seeing what was being done and naming it so the other person knew it wasn't invisible. And what Marcus had said back was not duty. It was choice. "I know I don't have to. I'm here anyway." In a place built on obligation and force and the power that comes from one group holding keys and another group not, choice was a radical thing. It didn't make noise. It didn't announce itself. But it changed the nature of what was happening between them, quietly and completely. The event, when it happened on a Wednesday. The yard was almost empty. The cold snap had kept most of the men inside, but George had gone out, the way he sometimes did regardless of weather, standing near the far wall with his face tilted slightly up in that way he had. 3 men came out after him. Marcus saw them come through the door from his position near the yard entrance and his body registered it before his mind named it. The positioning. The timing. The specific combination of who they were and where George was. He moved. He didn't run. Running draws attention, triggers responses, can escalate something that might still be nothing into something that is definitely something. He walked with the particular fast purpose of an officer on a direct errand, which is different from urgency in ways that matter in the vocabulary of this place. He reached George's position before the 3 men did by enough of a margin that when they arrived, Marcus was already standing there, clipboard in hand, in what any observer would read as a routine check-in. "Allenby," he said. "Medical wants to see you. Follow me." George looked at him. 1 beat. Then, he turned and followed without a word. Behind them, the 3 men stopped. Reformed their grouping. Did nothing, because now there was nothing to do. Marcus walked George back inside and down the corridor and around the corner and into the quieter east wing, and then he stopped and said nothing for a moment, and George stood beside him and also said nothing, and both of them understood what had just happened without the happening needing to be described. "Medical," George said finally, a slight dryness in it. "You've been having those headaches," Marcus said. George almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that, in a man who had been inside for 6 years and had spent most of that time carefully composed, was the equivalent of a full laugh from someone else. They stood there a moment longer. "It's Darrow," George said. "Not asking. Telling." "I know," Marcus said. "What he wants I can't give him. What I could give him I won't." George paused. "He's not going to stop." "No," Marcus said. "He's not." This was the part of the conversation that was also a different conversation, the one underneath the words. Marcus could escalate this formally, report his suspicion, request a threat assessment, push for Darrow to be moved to another block. There were mechanisms. They were slow, and they required things Marcus didn't yet have, and they would make George a documented person at risk, which would make him visible in ways that could draw exactly the attention it was trying to prevent. Or Marcus could keep doing what he was doing. Stay in the space. Make the informal interventions. Buy time. Neither option was clean. Neither option was without cost. George seemed to understand this too. I appreciate what you've been doing, he said. Not sentimental. Factual. The same way he might say the heating was broken or the day was cold. Marcus nodded. Get some water, he said. The head aches. George took the pivot. Right, he said. And they parted. The formal report Marcus filed that week was technically accurate and strategically minimal. He logged an observation about the yard positioning, 3 inmates gathering in proximity to a 4th, without naming it as a threat. He requested a review of yard scheduling on grounds of general management. He noted that inmate Allenby had been attending medical for recurring headaches and recommended a follow-up. Within the language of the institution, none of these things were remarkable. Taken together, they were a map. But maps only speak to people who know how to read them. His supervisor read the report and made a note about yard scheduling. Nothing further moved. Marcus didn't expect it to. He had been in this job long enough to know that institutions move slowly, that they respond to fires more readily than to smoke, and that the people inside institutions who work hardest to prevent fires are often less visible than the ones who respond to them. He went back to his rounds. Darrow was not stupid. That was the thing about men who operated the way Darrow did, they didn't last long in that position by making obvious moves. He adjusted his approach. Pulled back the visible pressure, removed the obvious players, gave it space to breathe. Any observer would have noted a reduction in tension. Marcus noted it the way you note when a dog stops barking, not as relief, but as information. During this period, George and Marcus settled into something that was, if you were watching from outside, which no one particularly was, a professional relationship operating at slightly above standard warmth. Marcus stopped to talk more often. The conversations were brief, mostly surface, mostly nothing. Books. Weather. The yard. Occasionally something else would surface, small and real, and then disappear again. George's daughter's wedding was in April. He mentioned it once, obliquely, and Marcus said he hoped the weather would be good, which was a stupid thing to say but was also the only thing to say, and George received it in the spirit it was offered. He would not be there. The wedding would happen without him, the way his daughter's life had been happening without him for 6 years, and would continue to happen after he was released, which was another 4 years off in ways that were irreversible and accumulating. These were not things George spoke about in any direct sense. But they lived in the shape of the conversations he did and didn't have, in the way the photographs sat on the shelf, in the way the letters came and were read and put away carefully. Marcus, who had 2 daughters of his own, 9 and 13, thought about this sometimes on the drive home. Not in a way that he would have called thinking. More like a weight that shifted and settled differently after being around George. He didn't voice it to his wife, not in any shape she could engage with. He just came home and sometimes stayed a few minutes longer at the dinner table, and sometimes stood in his younger daughter's doorway longer than he needed to. He didn't make the connection consciously. But it was there. In late March, something changed in Darrow's approach. It became apparent through a third party, a younger inmate, early 20s, who was new to Block D and who had been drawn into Darrow's orbit in the way new men sometimes were, before they understood the architecture of it. This young man, whose name was Pierce, made a point of sitting next to George in the canteen on a Tuesday and engaging him in conversation in a way that was friendly but had a purpose behind it, the way a door-to-door salesman is friendly. Marcus watched this from across the room. Pierce was not a bad person. He was a young person in a bad situation who was making the calculations available to him, and one of those calculations was that cozying up to someone Darrow wanted something from was useful currency. He probably hadn't thought through how that played out for George. Men in survival mode often don't think through how their moves affect the people adjacent to them. George handled it. He was polite, engaged briefly, gave nothing, and, by the time the meal was over, had managed to make the conversation exactly neutral, not a refusal, which would have been logged by Darrow's people, but not a cooperation either. He was good at this. He had clearly been good at it for years. But it told Marcus that Darrow was not done. He had just changed instruments. Marcus filed a note, informal, internal, about Pierce's seating patterns. He flagged to the staff handling Pierce's integration that the young man might benefit from a guided conversation about the social dynamics of Block D. This was code, and it was received as code, and within the week Pierce had a conversation with a senior officer that didn't mention Darrow by name but made certain things clear. Pierce moved his lunch table. Darrow noticed. Now it was between Darrow and Marcus in a way that didn't have any formal shape but was fully understood by both of them. Darrow couldn't touch Marcus directly, not without consequences far beyond whatever he might gain from George. But he could make noise. He put in a formal complaint against Marcus for what he called targeted harassment. The complaint specified 3 incidents of Marcus allegedly singling Darrow out during rounds, including language and manner. The complaint landed on Marcus's supervisor's desk. Marcus was called in. The conversation was professional, careful, as these things always were. His supervisor was a man named Carroll who had been in this system for 20 years and who read situations with the flat efficiency of someone who had processed a great many of them. He reviewed the complaint. He reviewed Marcus's conduct record, which was spotless. He asked Marcus directly if there was a reason Darrow might believe he was being targeted. Marcus said he had adjusted his rounds in the East Wing to improve coverage during a period of elevated general tension on the block, and that this had apparently brought him into more frequent contact with inmate Darrow than Darrow was accustomed to. Carroll looked at him for a moment. "All right," Carroll said. The complaint was filed and noted and effectively closed. "But," Carroll said, as Marcus was leaving, "you want to be careful with the informal interventions, Webb. Keep it visible. Keep it documentable. If something's happening, let it come through the proper channels." Marcus said he understood. He did understand. He also understood that the proper channels were slower than what was building, and that by the time something came through them clean enough to act on, it might come through someone else. He went back to Block D and did his rounds. George was in his cell, reading. He looked up when Marcus passed, and there was a question in the look. Something had shifted in the institutional atmosphere and George, who was finely tuned to such shifts, had felt it. Marcus shook his head very slightly. "Fine. Continue." George went back to his book. Marcus continued the round. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the sky was doing something complicated with clouds and late afternoon light, the kind of sky that in a different life would make you want to stand outside and look at it. Marcus looked at it for a moment from inside the glass, from inside the corridor, from inside 11 years of this job and this choice and this particular kind of faithfulness to something that had no formal name. Then, he went on to the next cell. And the day moved forward. And the thing between Darrow and George and Marcus continued to build toward whatever it was going to build toward, quietly, in the grammar of small moves and careful watching that was the only language available to them in this place. Spring was coming. The light was changing. Somewhere in the world outside these walls, a young woman was planning a wedding, probably choosing flowers, probably trying on dresses, probably writing letters to a father who would not be in the photographs. And here, a man read his book, and another man walked his rounds, and the walls held everything in, and the silence between them held everything else. April arrived and the light shifted in that particular way that happens in enclosed places, not warmth, exactly, but the memory of warmth, a brightness through the narrow windows that made the concrete look briefly like something else. The men on Block D felt it. You could tell in the way they moved through the yard, slower, slightly less coiled. Spring in a place like this didn't mean freedom. But it meant a loosening of something, like a fist opening part way. For Marcus, it meant the thing he had been managing quietly and carefully for 3 months was about to become impossible to continue managing quietly. Because something had shifted in the information available to him, and that shift required a decision he had been, in some private part of himself, already knowing was coming. It was a junior officer named Santos who brought it to him. Santos was 2 years in, sharp-eyed, still at the stage of the job where things surprised him, which was not a flaw but a resource. He had been doing a late-night check on the East Corridor and had heard something, a conversation, partial, through a cell wall, and had noted it and sat on it for a day before deciding to bring it to Marcus rather than file it formally. "Probably nothing," Santos said. "Tell me," Marcus said. What Santos had heard was a fragment. 3 voices, maybe, hard to separate through concrete. The words that stood out: Allenby. Wednesday. The kitchen corridor. Wednesday was 4 days away. The kitchen corridor was a stretch between the canteen and the food storage area, a 30-second walk that was part of George's Tuesday and Thursday work detail, except that the schedule had been changed. Marcus knew this, and apparently so did whoever was talking to Wednesday this week due to a deep clean operation in one of the other areas. The schedule change had only been confirmed 2 days ago. Which meant whoever was talking had access to real-time institutional information, which meant either the information had been shared by someone on staff or someone was very carefully watching the patterns. Marcus thanked Santos. He told him he'd handle it. He said it in a tone that indicated Santos should let him handle it and not escalate further until told to, and Santos, to his credit, read that correctly and nodded. Marcus spent the rest of that shift thinking through what he had, which was almost enough and not quite enough. Almost enough to go formally, the combination of his 3 months of observations, the Darrow complaint, Santos's fragment, and not quite enough to guarantee it would be acted on in the 4 days available. Formal processes in this institution, in his experience, moved in 5 to 10 working day cycles, with escalations and reviews built in. 4 days was not 5 working days. 4 days was a Wednesday. He made his decision at the end of the shift, in the locker room, sitting on the bench with his coat on and his bag in his hand, running through it one more time. He went to Carol. He laid out everything. All of it. Not as a series of informal observations but as a structured account: dates, times, the yard incident, Pierce, the complaint he believed Darrow had filed as a strategic interference measure, Santos's report. He held nothing back and dressed nothing up. He spoke for maybe 12 minutes without notes because he knew it clearly enough that he didn't need them. Carol listened without interruption. When Marcus finished, there was a pause. "You've been sitting on parts of this for months," Carol said. "Not an accusation. An observation. I didn't have enough until now." "You had enough for the yard incident." "Reporting the yard incident formally would have escalated the exposure on Allenby before I had a clear picture of the whole shape of it. I made a judgment call." Another pause. "I'll need Santos's written report," Carol said. "Get it to me tonight." "I'll get it now." He got it now. Santos wrote the report in the break room at 8:40 that evening, clear and factual, exactly what he'd heard and when and where. Marcus took it to Carol's office and waited while Carol read it and made several calls and sent 2 emails, and then Carol told him that the kitchen corridor work assignment would be modified and that there would be additional coverage on Block D through Wednesday, distributed across multiple officers so that no single pattern was visible. Additionally, Darrow would be moved to Block B pending a formal review of the complaint against Marcus, which meant the complaint, Darrow's defensive move, had now become the mechanism for his own removal from the board. Carol looked at Marcus across the desk. "Unconventional," he said. Marcus said nothing. "Effective," Carol added. And that was that. Darrow was moved on Monday morning. The process was clean, procedural, unremarkable to anyone watching who didn't know what it was. George would not have known the full shape of it. He would have noticed the absence, the way the architecture of pressure around him shifted. He was a man who read environments. He would have felt the change. He said nothing about it to Marcus for 2 days. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, the Wednesday that had been 4 days away when Santos brought Marcus the fragment, the Wednesday that would have been the kitchen corridor, George was in his cell and Marcus stopped in the doorway during rounds. George looked up from his book. He held Marcus's gaze for a moment. Then, he said, quietly and without preamble, "Thank you." Marcus said, George looked back at his book. Marcus moved on. That was it. That was the whole of it. 2 words and 1 sound, in a doorway, in a corridor, in a prison on the edge of a city. And, somehow it was the largest conversation they had ever had. The weeks following had a different quality. Not easier, exactly, nothing inside that place was ever easy, the basic texture of it was what it was, but something had settled. Dara was not coming back to Block D. The pressure that had been building since February had stopped building. George moved through the block with the same contained quiet as before, but, without the micro-adjustments Marcus had been watching, the careful raw planning, the shortened yard time. He went to the yard and stood near the far wall and looked at the sky. Marcus watched him do this from the corridor window sometimes. Not as oversight. Just as the specific act of watching someone allowed to exist without threat, which sounds like a small thing and was not. In May, George received a letter. The usual pattern, he'd be quiet for a day or two after. But, this time something was different in how he held the quiet. On the second day Marcus stopped in the doorway during rounds and George looked up and there was something in his face that wasn't the usual compressed stillness. Something that had opened slightly, like a window that had been stuck for years shifting on its frame. "She sent photographs," he said. "From the wedding." Marcus waited. "She looks happy." George's voice was exactly even. He was working to keep it that way, and the work of it was visible only because Marcus had been watching long enough to know what George's face looked like when nothing was being worked at. "Good photographs?" Marcus said. "Very good." A pause. "She wore her mother's earrings." Marcus didn't know anything about the mother. He didn't know if the mother was alive or gone or elsewhere. The earrings were there in the sentence, weighted with all of it, and he did not ask. "She looks like a woman who's going to be all right," George said. Which was not really about the photographs. Or it was about the photographs and also about everything photographs represent: proof, continuity, the ongoing life of people you love continuing to be ongoing even while you are in here, which is the most complicated of all the things a person inside has to find a way to live with. Marcus said, "That's good, George." It was the first time he had used his name. He wasn't sure why he did it then. Maybe because the moment required it. Maybe because they had been through enough by that point that the formal distance of surnames was simply the wrong shape for what was in the room. George noticed. He looked at Marcus for a moment. Then, he nodded, once, and looked back at the photograph in his hands. Marcus continued the round. Over the summer, the dynamic between them became a known thing on the block without becoming a talked-about thing. Other officers knew that Marcus and Allenby had an understanding. Nobody made anything of it, partly because Marcus's record was clean and partly because what was between them was clearly not leverage, not George getting something improper, not Marcus getting something improper, but just a relationship, human and specific, that had formed in the way things form when you put people in close proximity for long enough and some of them choose to be decent. A new inmate came onto Block D in June. Early 40s, frightened, trying not to show it. The day he arrived, Marcus watched George notice him across the common room with the particular attention Marcus recognized, not predatory, not calculating, just the precise observation of a man who had once been in exactly that position. Frightened. New. Trying to read the architecture. George walked over. He sat down across from the man. He said something Marcus was too far away to hear. The new inmate's shoulders, which had been up around his ears, came down a fraction. Marcus watched this. He thought about what it meant to be shaped by something. How a place shapes you, how an experience shapes you, how another person shapes you, not by telling you what to do but by doing, in front of you, the thing that shows you what's possible. He thought about his grandmother and the door and the people who came through it. He thought about the small, invisible accumulation of what decent behavior produces over time, how it passes sideways and forward without being tracked. He didn't think all of this clearly. It was more like a feeling that had the outline of those thoughts, standing in the corridor watching George talk to a frightened man. He went back to his rounds. In September, Carol put Marcus forward for a senior officer review, a formal acknowledgement of performance that would, if successful, come with increased responsibilities and modest pay. The recommendation letter cited consistency, judgment, and what Carol described as an unusual capacity for contextual assessment. It did not mention George. It did not mention Darrow. It did not mention a single specific incident from the months in which Marcus had been doing what he had been doing. Some things are visible in their outcomes long after they are invisible in their doing. Marcus passed the review. In December, George received his regular parole assessment. These were standard, formulaic, conducted by 2 assessors who reviewed the file and the behavior record and a personal statement. George had been through them before. He prepared the same way he always prepared, quietly, without particular hope or despair, treating it as a process to be moved through correctly. Marcus was not part of the assessment. He was not asked to provide input. He had no formal role in what happened in that room. But, 3 days before the assessment, he filed an informal character note. This was an optional mechanism, not widely used, slightly unusual, but legitimate. He noted inmate Allenby's consistent behavior over the reviewed period, his contribution to block stability, his role in the informal support of a new inmate, his engagement with his work detail, the absence of any incidents or documented concerns in the past year. He filed it and said nothing to George about it. The assessment went forward. The assessors reviewed the file. They noted the absence of incidents. They noted the behavior record. They noted the informal character note, which was unusual enough that one of them mentioned it briefly, procedurally, during the review. George was not granted early release. The case was deemed not yet suitable. 4 years remained on the sentence, as before. But, the assessment record, with its notations and the filed character note, became part of the file. Files accumulate. Files carry forward. The next assessment would build on this one. Marcus learned the outcome through standard channels. He did his rounds. He got to George's cell. George was reading. He looked up. His face said he already knew information moved through this place in its own invisible channels, and it said he was all right with it, or more precisely, that he had absorbed it in the way he absorbed all the difficult things, into the same contained space where the photographs and the letters and the years lived. Marcus stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything about the assessment. He didn't mention the character note. He said, "Book any good?" George looked at the cover as if considering it freshly. "Slow start," he said. "Gets better." "Usually does," Marcus said. He moved on. The year turned. The work continued. The rounds happened every day, the same corridors, the same cells, the same faces in various configurations of what time and circumstance had made them. Marcus did his job. George did his time. The walls held everything in. And, in the space between one person doing their job and another person doing their time, in the doorways and the corridors and the quiet exchanges that had no official category and left almost no trace in the formal record of either of their lives, something had happened that mattered. Something that could not be quantified or filed or reviewed. Something that existed only in the accumulated weight of small decisions made consistently over time, in the direction of dignity, in the direction of another person's survival. You would not call it friendship, exactly. The word was too symmetrical for something that existed within such uneven structures of power and freedom and confinement. You would not call it duty, because duty doesn't sit with someone in the dark space after bad news and say nothing and mean everything. It was something that the available words did not quite fit. Something that happened in the particular silence between 2 people who had agreed, without ever saying so, to be faithful to each other's humanity inside a system that did not require it and did not reward it and would never fully see it. The photograph on George's shelf had been joined by another one. The wedding. The laughing young woman in earrings that belonged to someone else, standing in a garden, permanent in paper, present in a cell in a prison on the edge of a city. George read his book. Slow start. Gets better. Marcus walked his rounds. The walls held everything in. And the silence between them had long since learned to speak.